Now that we have a few model classes created, we can start to work towards getting some data into those models. So over the next couple of lessons, we're going to start to actually retrieve some data, download some data, and parse some data, and ultimately get it into these models so we can present it to the user via our views. If we're just being honest here, if you've ever worked with the MVC pattern before, you'll know that I'm going to throw this out there as a generality, as a generalization, so take it for what it's worth. But typically the models and the views within MVC are typically rather boring, for lack of a better word. Most of the time, you're going to see a lot of the work done within the controllers, whose job is going to be to pass data and interaction back and forth between the models and the views, and then maybe go out to web services or websites or wherever it may be to go and get some data. Now, there's other situations where you might have the models do some of that work, so maybe have some of the business logic, maybe if you're working with applications that are handling maybe bank accounts or banking institutions and things like that. You might, in certain instances, you're going to find more logic kind of living in that world of the model. But in our case, they're going to be rather boring, and the controller is where most of this is going to happen. And that's where we're going to start right now. So the first thing we want to do is be able to enable our application to download data and ultimately parse this XML that's going to be passed into it. So luckily for us, within iOS, there's actually a class that's going to help us do just that. So I'm going to create a new instance of this, and we're going to call it a parser. And the type that we're going to use here, the class that's going to be available to us, is called an NSXML parser. Now, an NSXML parser is going to allow us to do two things: download data from the internet, and then parse it, obviously, if it's XML. So we're going to say that we want a new instance of our parser, and then we're just going to initialize it to an empty or a default instance of this particular class. So we're going to modify this a little bit later, but for the time being, we're just kind of getting started. Now, in order for us to also get started, we're going to throw in here a not really throwaway code, but just something that we can use to kind of get started. So we've created a property here that has our parser in it, but we're also ultimately going to need a URL that's going to contain the URL that has a reference to our data that we want to download, that we're ultimately going to download. And we're going to use this as an example here. If you go to the Apple website and you take a look at apple.com/RSS, they have a whole slew of RSS feeds, and about halfway down, you have the Apple Developer News feed, which is a pretty good one to keep on top of, especially if you're continuing to learn how to develop applications for the iOS platform. So this is our URL that we need to pay attention to. So developer.apple.com/news/RSS/news.RSS. So I'm just going to copy this for now. We'll head back over to our application. We're going to create a feed URL, which is going to be our property name, and this is going to be a string. And I'm going to leave it as a string for a particular reason here, and you'll see why in just a second. So now we're going to pop down into our view did load, and I'm going to get rid of all these comments here. And if you remember, the view did load method here, or function, is going to be called as soon as the view controller starts up and presents the view to the user. So as soon as it begins to load that information to show to the user, that's when this particular method fires, and it's typically a good time to start doing some of your wiring up code. So I'm going to initialize our feed URL, and I'm going to set it to the URL that we downloaded or that we were showing to the developer news feed. So now we have this guy. So what I want to do is I want to then give this URL to the parser to let it know where it needs to go and retrieve the data from. As you can see here, I just kind of gave it an initialization of the basic initializer here, the result of that, which doesn't really contain any data yet. So I'm going to, within my view did load, I'm going to create a new instance of my parser, and we're going to set that equal to NSXML parser. And if you take a look at the different initializers you have here, you have the empty one, which we use, but then you also have three other ones. You have the contents of URL, which allows us to give to it a URL that it's going to go and ultimately download and parse. Then we have some that are going to allow you to actually parse data that you already have, that you've already downloaded possibly in an NS data type, and then also be able to retrieve something from a stream. So in our case, we're just going to pass to it a URL, but as you can see here, it wants of type NS URL, but our feed here is a string. So how do we change this string to a URL? Now, this may seem very simple, very straightforward, but you're going to run into a lot of instances of this if you're just new to iOS development of how do I get from one data type to another. Now, luckily, we are working with a string, and there's a lot of classes that provide initializers that will allow us to do it basically automatically for us. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a constant in this case, since we know it's not going to change in this particular example because we're just hard coding this data in here. We're going to create a constant with the let keyword, and this is going to be initialized or is going to be specified as an NSURL. So that's what we need to pass into our initializer here. And we're going to initialize this to a new instance of NSURL, but we're going to use the string initializer. We're going to pass in our feed URL. So now we have an NSURL, and then we should just very simply be able to pass this to our initializer. But you're very quickly going to see we have two problems here. Now, once again, this is going to be very common if you're just getting started, so you can click on these and they're going to give you a little bit of help. And if it's this one that has a white circle in it here, it's actually going to present a fix for you that you can take advantage of. So it says here that the value of an optional type NSURL is not unwrapped. So if you're unfamiliar with optionals or what they are, then I urge you to go back to my previous course and take a look at the lesson on optionals, and it will do a better job of explaining it in more detail. But for the time being, just think of an optional as a type that may or may not actually have a value of that type. So this is kind of the version of maybe a nullable type, if you're used to that in other languages, that's presented to you in Swift. So what's happening here, if you take a look at this NSURL initializer, you'll see here that it's actually returning a nullable of NSURL because it doesn't know if you're passing in good data or not. And so it may not actually provide enough information to create an NSURL. But in our case, we know that it is because we're passing it in here, so we don't have to worry about it too much. So then the way that we tell Swift or anything else that's looking at this, especially this little compile error, the way that we say, yes, I know it's an optional, but I want you to take the value in there anyway, is by using the exclamation point. And so if we add that on there, it's going to say, yep, I just want you to take this and tell it it's going to be an NSURL, and that's the end of that. Same thing with NSXML parser here. We're going to do the same thing, and that's going to say, okay, parser now definitely contains an NSXML parser. There we go. So now what we want to be able to do is, now that we have this parser all set up, we want to say, hey, go get my data and parse it out for me. Well, the first thing that you're going to think, all right, well, if I take a look at parser, I'm going to find that on this particular class, there is a parse function. So this guy will actually go out, download the data, and then begin the parsing process. But unfortunately, that's where all of the pre-built stuff for you stops. In order to actually get this to work, you have to provide some implementations to tell the parser what to do with the data when it gets it. So the way that we do that is in the form of a delegate. So I'm going to say parser.delegate is going to be equal to self, which means I want the delegate of the NSXML parser to be this particular view controller. Now, if you're unfamiliar with delegates, then I'm going to give you the very simplified version right now. A delegate is a way within the iOS platform to say that I know that there's going to be some points during the processing of this particular class, and in this case I'm talking about a parser, where it's going to need me to do some work, or it needs something to do some work to actually finish the process of all this downloading and parsing business. And what a delegate is it is a contractual agreement that's going to say, I agree to implement those particular functions or methods, or however you want to look at them, to provide that functionality to this particular class. So in order to do that, we need to come up to our class declaration up here, our class feeds table view controller, and we need to add on to the end of this, now after UI table view controller, a comma, and say that I agree that this class is going to be an NSXML parser delegate. Now this little red guy is going to go away, and now we're going to say, okay, I will be your delegate. Whenever you hit one of those points, of needing some additional implementation, I am going to provide them to you. Now, we don't really do anything with it yet, but in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to actually get in there and use the functions within the NSXML parser delegate to actually start to build up this view controller and then ultimately finish this whole parsing process and actually see some data manipulation happening.